Hey everyone, today we are going to be learning about FDR's New Deals. Your warm-up questions are, how were the experiences of women and African American people similar during the Great Depression? What is the importance of the bonus army marchers, and how did people feel about Hoover? Women and African American people were often last hired, first fired. Therefore, their employment rates would be higher during the Great Depression. I'm going to skip to how do people feel about Hoover, the third one. People did not like President Hoover largely. They felt that he wasn't doing enough to end the Great Depression. And for the bonus army marchers, here we go, demonstrates that people of all races can unite under a common cause. This is another point that I want to make sure I highlight. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a haven for African American people to celebrate their culture, enjoying music and art before the race riot that took place there. So today we have that warm up. We'll do these New Deal slides, then a short activity and your exit ticket, which has to do with the following essential questions. Was the New Deal really a new deal for the African American people? I'm sorry, just for the American people in general. Of course, you will consider unique groups. And was the New Deal a fair deal for the American people? Let's start with who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Try to pick up some information about him from this video to describe to me afterwards, who was he? What can you tell us about him?
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 37th presidential election in American history took place on November 8th, 1932. A lot had changed since 1928. Herbert Hoover's time in office started out so promising. But on October 29th, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed and triggered a bunch of events into motion that devastated economies around the entire world. During the Hoover administration, industrial production shrank by 46%, wholesale prices dropped by 32%, and foreign trade shrank by 70%, while unemployment increased by 607%. 1 in 4 Americans couldn't find work, even though they often moved across the country, sometimes on foot, in order to find it. Personal income, tax revenue, and profits all dropped. The crime rate increased as unemployed workers often stole food to survive. Suicide rates and alcoholism rose. Marriages were delayed because many men wanted to wait until they could actually provide for a family. Less kids were born. It just sucked. It really, really sucked. Today we call this period of severe economic turmoil the Great Depression. Hoover had the great misfortune of being in charge when this happened, and so therefore became a great scapegoat. It's not like he didn't try very hard to stop it. He called for billions of dollars in taxpayer money for public works programs to create jobs. Ever hear of the Hoover Dam? Yep, that was named after him. He called for stronger labor regulation laws. He called for the federal government to start bailing out struggling industries. To pay for this, he called for more taxes. Oops. He also raised tariffs by signing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And many argue that by doing all of these things, Hoover was actually making the Depression worse. Economists still argue about this today, but the bottom line is, in 1932, Hoover was not so popular. You could see this by the thousands of World War I veterans and their families camped out in Washington, D.C., demanding payments of a bonus that had been promised. Or the slums, nicknamed Hoovervilles, built by the poor people who couldn't find work. Hoover had grown to hate the presidency, but he didn't think any other Republican could do a better job than him, so he decided to run again. What's surprising is that the Republican Party overwhelmingly supported his renomination. Charles Curtis would also run again as VP, baby. Kansas represent, although he barely got renominated. The Democratic Party seemed rejuvenated in 1932. They had 3 candidates competing for the nomination. Al Smith, the former governor of New York, seeking the presidency a 4th time, his friend but increasingly vocal critic, Franklin Roosevelt, who now was the governor of New York, and Speaker of the House, John Nance Garner, who was from Texas. The Democrats went with Roosevelt, with Garner as his running mate. There were many third parties, but only one really stood out much: the Socialist Party. They nominated Norman Thomas, a minister from New York. He also ran in 1928, but this time had growing support as so many Americans were unhappy with Hoover, yet also not satisfied with the Democrats. The Socialists nominated James Maurer, a trade unionist from Pennsylvania, as his running mate. On the campaign trail, Hoover did his best to defend his record, but the odds were against him. Not only did many Americans blame Hoover for the Great Depression, most now were strongly against prohibition, which was also associated with his administration. Roosevelt now seemed like a rock star, drawing huge crowds and inspiring hope that he had solutions to end the Depression. While Roosevelt didn't offer many specific solutions, he did get specific when criticizing Hoover. Roosevelt criticized the Smoot-Hawley tariff and the Hoover administration for taxing and spending way too much. His running mate, Garner, went further, accusing Hoover of quote, leading the country down the path of socialism. Toward the end of campaigning, things got downright nasty between the two, with Hoover calling Roosevelt a, quote, chameleon in plaid, and Roosevelt calling Hoover a fat, timid capon. A capon is a castrated rooster, by the way. And here are the results. No surprise here. Franklin Roosevelt won, becoming the 32nd president in American history. He received 472 electoral votes and 57.4% of the popular vote. It was the first win for the Democrats since 1916, and an impressive one at that. Roosevelt received the highest percentage of the popular vote ever for a Democratic nominee. Hoover got just 59 electoral votes and 39.7% of the popular vote. Norman Thomas finished third with 2.2% of the popular vote. John Nance Garner, aka Cactus Jack, became the 32nd vice president in American history. This election was significant because it marked the beginning of 20 straight years of Democratic control of the White House. In fact, Democrats would be in office 28 out of the next 36 years. And get used to that name, Franklin Roosevelt. He's going to be around a while. See you for the next election, buddy.
All right, nice. There's our information about President Roosevelt. We'll learn a little bit more about him more in the slides. In the 1932 election, Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins the 1932 election. What does this tell us about how people felt about Hoover? Take a look at the poster on the right. If you like the Depression and want more, vote for Hoover. They're saying Hoover is not helping them get out of the Depression. They're unsatisfied with him. This allowed Democrats to take control of the U.S. Senate as well. On Inauguration Day, which is the day where the newly elected president takes over in office officially, Hoover believed the promise of a New Deal was both socialistic and fascistic. It would lead the country on a march to Moscow. This is related to the Red Scare. How? The Red Scare is about being afraid of communism, socialism, fascism. And we saw in that era that Russia was embracing those kind of ideals, and the United States saw that as a threat to the capitalism and democracy that they had created. So we see Hoover insulting FDR, saying, I don't like you. I don't trust your policies. They're going to ruin the nation. And FDR just shouting out, you're going to love my New Deal. You get a New Deal, and you get a New Deal, and you get a New Deal. It's going to be great. Everybody's going to benefit from this New Deal that I'm going to set up here. FDR was promising this, quote, New Deal for the American people. What would you expect from FDR and the federal government when you hear this promise of a New Deal? What does that mean to you? Take a moment to think for yourself, but let's find out. Let's also consider, how will FDR be similar or different to Hoover? This is a prediction, so I'm not going to answer this question quite yet. Let's analyze what we know about their campaigns so far. Hoover was hands-off, laissez-faire, right? FDR's campaign, he's going to be hands-on. He's going to be regulating. He's going to be stepping in where Hoover refused to. Let's leave it at that for now. Let's learn a little bit more about FDR from the History Channel.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Here was this aristocrat from Dutchess County, confined to a wheelchair, Harvard educated, but because of his almost innate sense of communication skills and the medium of radio, he was transported into the living rooms of almost every home in America. And in our household, FDR was a demigod. He was the voice that always gave them hope. My parents really worshipped FDR. And it was not just because of policies, they felt connected to him because of that great warm radio voice and that amazing ability that he had to speak directly to the fears and the hopes of the American people.
I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
FDR and the Great Depression and the New Deal was an amazing time because FDR was about establishing hope, trying to bring hope back to life for people caught in this unbelievably chaotic period of economic chaos and stress.
In a lot of ways, FDR was actually extremely unlikely figure to become a sort of moral and visionary leader in the ways that he did. Now, I think there's a great myth of FDR that he came into office, the country rallied around him, and the Depression was eventually solved. But that's not true. FDR was hated passionately by large portions of the population. And yet he did something really significant in those first months. First of all, he acted, and he acted in significant ways. And he came in saying, we can whip this thing, and whether or not he quite did it in those first months, he brought dramatic new ideas to the table and really did upend a lot of assumptions and make the idea that change really was possible a reality in many ways.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
Anytime we examine the New Deal, the legislation that FDR initiated as swiftly as he took the oath of office, you have to put it in the context of what had come before. We'd had a run of Republican pro-business presidents of the United States. President Hoover was one of them. Cal Coolidge was another one, obviously. FDR came along and determined that something much more was needed to save the country, to provide a kind of a lifeboat, if you will, legislatively. So the New Deal was a real upheaval of everything that had gone into it. And interestingly, Republicans in Congress were willing to go along because the country was in such desperate shape. The idea of Social Security or public works programs, the WPA, the various other agricultural programs, which became critically important to the restoration of American agriculture and the modernization of it. The Republicans were willing to try anything at that point because we were on the precipice. The entire country could have gone down, and almost did, from an economic point of view.
I hope you got a chance to take some notes on that video, but we will have a recap of some important things here as well. We have FDR's New Deal focused on relief, recovery, and reform. It's focused on providing relief for those suffering from unemployment and homelessness. It attempted to put as many Americans back to work as soon as possible. What are some ways that the government might be able to help create jobs? Think about it. They can invest in construction projects. That's a great way to help create jobs. The government wants to build new highways, new dams, things like that. They can invest in doing so and hire people to complete those projects. Leave it that example. You might think of some others in class. Recovery focused on agricultural and industrial recovery. It attempted to stimulate the economy by increasing production and supporting workers. And reform focused on reforming the financial system of the United States. You have to know these three parts of FDR's New Deal: relief, recovery, reform. Three R's. FDR was known for his can do attitude. He believed in the value of ideas, which is called pragmatism. There was no idea that he wouldn't try. If the idea worked, awesome. And if not, put it in the tried column and move on, but keep on trying. He wanted to take action. The world is changing, so actions need to change too. He created this brain trust. This was a group of professionals that he organized to advise the president. They were professors of philosophy, psychology, economics, and other similar industries. Why would he do that? He recognizes that he doesn't know everything. He's just one person. So he is hoping to organize a group of people who he can trust to give him some advice on industries that he's not as familiar with. He established the bank holiday. 2 days after taking office, FDR declared a bank holiday and closed all banks to prevent further withdrawals. He created the Emergency Banking Relief Act, where banks would be inspected and only financially sound banks would reopen. This renewed the confidence in banks. How much do you think this could change how much people deposit in banks? Probably go up from when they had the run on banks from last lesson and everybody was pulling their money out. Now there will be some confidence restored. I want you to re-explain this concept of the bank holiday. Make sure you understand it. Pause to re-explain. Go back to this slide to consult. Closed all banks to prevent further withdrawals. Doing so would prevent further amounts of people from withdrawing their money, because remember, banks are closing on the daily because they can't give their people, their customers, back the money that has been donated to them, or not donated, invested in their banks. That's the concept of the bank holiday. FDR also started these fireside chats. These were weekly radio addresses made by FDR addressing public concerns, in plain English, about the New Deal. FDR seemed to personally connect with his audience. In the first chat, he explained the banking system to the nation, and the next day, people began to deposit their money back in banks. Why would FDR choose the radio to communicate with the American people? Many people are starting to have radios in their homes at this time, so he sees this as an accessible tool for people who don't take the time to buy a newspaper, for people who don't take the time to go to his presidential rallies or news press conferences. This is a way that he can be seen as relatable and communicate to the largest amount of people as possible. How did Roosevelt use new technology in his fireside chats? I want you to recall what piece of technology he used. The radio. That's what you need to remember from this fireside chat. So that's what you might have a question about. All right, let's read this letter to the president and think about the question, how did the radio change how people felt about FDR? Dear sir, being a citizen of little or no consequence, I feel the utter futility of writing to the president at a time such as this, but I trust you will accept this letter in the spirit in which it was written. For me to sit down to write to any public official, whoever it may be, it must be prompted by a very special and appealing occasion or personality. That happened last evening as I listened to the president's broadcast. I felt that he walked into my home, sat down, and in plain and forceful language explained to me how he was tackling the job I and my fellow citizens gave him. I thought, what a splendid thing it would be if he could find time to do that occasionally. Needless to say, such forceful, direct, and honest action commands the respect of all Americans. It is certainly deserving of it. May my humble and sincere gratitude to a great leader. May God protect him. Respectfully, J.F. Bando. Think about that question on the right. This is the quote that I want you to really see. I felt that he walked into my home, sat down, and in plain and forceful language explained to me how he was tackling the job I and my fellow citizens gave him. Through the radio, he was able to create a personalized experience with his constituents to allow them to understand exactly what these complicated things he was doing in office and why the people should continue to support him. Everyday people might not be seeing a change in this depression right away. So he's stepping in to explain what he's doing, how it will create a change with their patience and their devotion. Oops. All right, let's take a look at another one. What concerns do some people have about FDR? Dear Mr. President, last Sunday evening, 6 of our friends came in for dinner and contract, which is a bridge game. The men were not so much depressed as thoroughly frightened. Their wives were wonderful, pretending to make light of the situation with such remarks as, you know, John always worries about the things that will never happen, etc. But in my dressing room after dinner, they spoke differently. Like, I wonder if the president means to make a Soviet Russia of this country. Why the new tie-up? I don't pretend to follow politics, but I hope things aren't a tenth as bad as John imagines. At 10 o'clock, all playing ceased, while each and everyone straightened forward to catch the least inflection of your magnetic, inspiring voice. As you finished, the effect was a combustion of gaiety, taut nerves let loose. The men fairly jumped up and down like happy children. The women were inwardly thanking God, and one dear soul let loose the floodgates of tears of relief. Mr. President, I'm sure that scene was duplicated in thousands of homes, the length and breadth of the land, and I can't help writing you to thank you. You said you couldn't perform miracles, but you have. With the assurance of my highest regard, Mrs. H. Howard Harper, Margaret Harper of New York. The concerns that I'm wanting you to see, make sure you pause to think about the question, are in the first paragraph. The concerns that he's making a Soviet Russia of this country. This is related to the Red Scare. They're afraid that FDR is bringing communism to the country, fascism. They don't want the country to become a communist country or like a communist country. But after listening to FDR speak, they understand that he knows what he's doing and he's trying to bring the country out of depression. He broke down his thoughts so that it no longer sounded like a Soviet Russia country, that it sounded like the United States, and FDR knew what he was doing to protect it. Here's a final letter. What are some people asking of from the president? When you read this, you will probably think that I am the biggest fool in the world, but you are the only one I know could help me. I have always wanted to be a farmer, not to get rich, but to make a living for my mother, 2 brothers, and my sister. To give them an education, something that I always wanted and never got. I want to feed them on more than oatmeal and bread and get a start in this world. Everyone has to have a start. You did, Lincoln did, and I want that chance. What is he asking FDR to do? He's asking him to support farmers, to help get them out of poverty, to support education, to help people to have sustainable, healthy meals. Those are some of the wishes he's citing in that paragraph. Here's another one. Why do people write to the president? Dear Mr. President, would you please direct the people in charge of the relief work in Georgia to issue the provisions and other supplies to our suffering colored people? I am sorry to worry you with this, Mr. President, but hard as it is to believe the relief officials here are using up most everything that you send for them, selves plus their friends. They give out the relief supplies here on Wednesday of this week and give us black folks, each one, nothing but a few cans of pickle meat. And to white folks, they give blankets, folds of cloth, and things like that. I don't want to take much of your time, Mr. President, but we'll give you just one example of how the relief is worked down here. The widow Nancy Hendricks owns lands, stockholder in the bank of this town, and she is being supplied with blankets, cloth, and gets a supply of canned goods regular. This is only one case, but I could tell you of many. Please help us, Mr. President, because we can't help ourselves. And we know you as the president and a good Christian man. We is praying for you. Yours truly can't sign my name, Mr. President. They will beat me up and run me away from here, and this is my home. From Anonymous. Why do people write to the president? Begging him for help, and he is informing him of a situation. He thinks to himself, or the writer, not necessarily a man, but this writer thinks to himself, I know what's going down here in my home. I know of this discrimination that I see. And I'm going to be brave enough to write to the president and inform the president of this, just in case there's a chance that the president might not know that this discrimination is what is happening, and beg him for help, that he changes his system to be better supportive of all people, not just white people. To what extent does the American public feel a personal connection to the president today in 2023? Those were all about the personal connection that people felt to FDR in the 1930s. What kind of personal connection do people feel today? You all will have personal opinions, but overall, I would say not as much. People, probably few of you have written to the president in your lifetime, maybe as a class assignment. I don't know about on your own time. Raise your hand if you have, if we're in class. I'm just curious, like, how involved people are, and do you think that the current president or any presidents in your lifetime did anything like the fireside chats to Sorry, just 1 second. Do you think that any president does anything like the fireside chats to help people feel connected? Let's look at this one. What else do some people not like about FDR? Sir, your latest piece of glorified propaganda, miscalled fireside chats, was disheartening, sickening. I must confess, I am ashamed that I once had some faith in you and your New Deal. Prosperity? How you mock us. There can never be any true prosperity under your administration. Nothing but a vast destruction of wealth and hope, a degrading and demoralizing of our national character. Why not be perfectly frank with your people just once and admit that you are engaged in a subtle and gigantic effort to ruin the investing classes, big and little? Why not come out in the open and declare your unalterable and all too evident purpose to usher in government ownership of all important businesses in a socialist state? For the hypocrisy of the New Deal is revolting. Again, this is another just example of them saying that FDR is trying to build a socialist state. He's trying to make the private businesses government owned, is what he's saying there. And this person who's writing in does not like that idea at all. This says 4.5 years into the New Deal. Hooverville, USA. What does this political cartoon tell us about how some people felt about FDR? They feel like he's doing nothing. Look, these people suffering. We're still in Hooverville, 4.5 years into the New Deal. Remember, that's FDR's plan. So they feel he's not doing enough. In Roosevelt's second term from 1936 to 1940, he wins a landslide election victory. What did some people like about FDR? They liked this New Deal he was putting forward. They liked how he was approachable, how he explained what he was doing. He helped the banks to be recovering. And this time he decides to focus on the second New Deal, which would provide more extensive relief for both farmers and workers. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, was observing social conditions and advocated for additional women's African American and minority rights. Let's watch this video about her.
Eleanor
Roosevelt had an active political career in her own right. She pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be a first lady.
Eleanor Roosevelt came from a New York aristocratic family. Her father was Teddy Roosevelt's brother. She meets Franklin Roosevelt. They get married in 1905. Franklin Roosevelt is her fifth cousin. She gave birth to 6 children. In 1918, she discovers her husband is having an affair. And that is when childbearing and marital intimacy come to an end.
She lived a separate life. He lived a separate life, but the relationship with her husband evolved where they were well and truly partners.
Eleanor Roosevelt really innovated the First Lady's role as a public communicator.
She wrote thousands of columns, 27 books. She participated in hundreds of radio shows.
When she came into the White House, one of the first things she did was to establish women-only press conferences. So all the reporters who covered her came to the White House were female.
She would give them tidbits about White House life that the male press corps wasn't getting. It saved a lot of newspaper women's jobs.
During World War II, she traveled to the front lines in Europe and in the Pacific to support soldiers.
She met with servicemen in hospitals, took notes, and even contacted their families. There were some individuals that thought that she should stay at home and be the hostess and nothing else. That was not her.
Eleanor Roosevelt's biggest accomplishments were the public stances that she took, especially about civil rights. She went to Alabama for a conference. She requested a chair of her own, placed it squarely between the aisle for whites and the aisle for blacks. It was a very visible way to take a stand in opposition to the Jim Crow laws in the South.
The work that she did for equality continued after she was no longer First Lady.
Harry Truman appointed her as delegate to the United Nations, and she was absolutely instrumental in drafting the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which still informs human rights around the world today.
Eleanor Roosevelt was definitely amazing person, and I was really interested that they actually brought up that her husband was known to be having an affair, and they decided to stay married but kind of live separate lives, because I knew that fact but didn't expect it to be stated in this history video. Honestly, I had forgotten what was spoken about in it, and I thought it was nice that they were straightforward about that, because during that time, of course, it wouldn't have been common knowledge that he and his wife had marital issues. The Second New Deal had a lot of these programs that were created that have abbreviations. You don't really need to memorize them, but you might be asked about some of the changes that were made. Not necessary to memorize each of the industry names and what they did, but the general concepts are nice to know. We have the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. This paid farmers for cutting production of soil-depleting crops and rewarded farmers for practicing good soil conservation methods. This was brought back in the Second New Deal without the provision that was declared unconstitutional. Previously, FDR tried to add more Supreme Court judges to get his policies approved, and this was declared unconstitutional. The Farm Security Administration, or FSA, aimed to assist tenant farmers and hired photographers and journalists to share their stories with the nation. Look at this photo on the right. This photo is called the Migrant Mother. Why would this photo be effective in persuading citizens to support FDR's programs? It shows a mother suffering with her children, and people would want a change for people like this. It's an emotional thought photo. People might see themselves in this woman or these children and want to make sure that they are working or supporting as much as they can to end this Great Depression. And some people would think that they might be able to do that through supporting the New Deal programs. We also have the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act. The federal government again protected the rights of workers to join unions and engage in collective bargaining with employers. The protection that labor unions gained from the Wagner Act helped them to grow quickly. And we have the Social Security Act, which provided aid to retirees, the unemployed, people with disabilities, and families with dependent children. As we watch this video, think to yourself, do you think that Social Security is a good government policy? It's an opinion question.
Is Social Security the best government program ever or the worst?
This Social Security measure
On August 14th, 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act to reduce poverty among the elderly. But after 8 decades, Social Security doesn't get the respect it deserves.
It is a Ponzi scheme.
Social Security is actually worse than a Ponzi scheme.
Others say it's about to go bankrupt, or maybe it's broken already. But Social Security isn't just doing fine, it's doing much better than fine. In fact, it might be the largest and most successful government policy in the history of the United States. Here's how it works. It takes about 1/8 of each worker's salary, up to about $113,000. This is the payroll tax, and it funds about 96% of the program. Social Security also gives to retired workers, to the families of deceased workers, and to disabled Americans and their families. How does Social Security decide how much you get when you retire? It considers 2 main factors: how much you made and how long you worked. The more you earn and the later you retire, the bigger the Social Security checks. Higher earning workers receive larger checks when they retire. After all, they paid more money into the system when they were working. But lower income workers receive checks that represent a larger percentage of their income. And it works. Social Security has eliminated the vast majority of elderly poverty in America. Today, the program is solely responsible for lifting 22 million Americans out of poverty. That includes about 1/3 of our senior citizens. Half of Black and Hispanic retirees make 90% of their income from Social Security. It might be the most effective anti-poverty program in the history of this country. So why do some people hate Social Security? Some people are afraid Social Security is going bankrupt. And it's true that baby boomers will slowly drain down the $3 trillion stockpile that Social Security has amassed over the last few decades. By 2033, we won't necessarily be able to pay all senior citizens everything that they're due. But that's not a reason to blow up Social Security. We just need to tweak it, as we've done so many times before. Other people are worried that Social Security is too generous. In fact, it's probably not generous enough. First, the US actually has one of the least generous public retirement programs among all rich economies. Second, Americans don't save on their own. Social Security offers a bargain that irresponsible Americans should probably welcome: short-term pain for long-term gain. Is it socialism? Maybe, but it's socialism that saves us from our human nature.
All right, this is an opinion question, so I won't discuss it here, but do keep in mind your reasoning behind your opinion. That's always the most important thing. The Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, became America's first female cabinet member. She played a major role in creating the Social Security system and supervised labor legislation. Roosevelt's Black cabinet was an influential group of African American people who came together to advise Roosevelt administration on racial issues. How might this representation for members of minority groups in the government influence the policies created? Let's think about that question as you watch this video, and then we'll discuss it together.
FDR understood that while in the South, he had to depend upon Southern segregationists to carry out the New Deal, that in the North and the Midwest, there was a rising power of Negro voters in major cities. And he was astute enough to try to speak to that through the construction of what became known as the Black Cabinet. Two of the key people were Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the head of the National Council of Negro Women and the most powerful and prominent Black educator during the 1930s. She was the president of Cookman, later Cookman Bethune College in Florida, and a close friend of Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and William Hastie, an attorney who subsequently became the U.S. representative and governor of the Virgin Islands. The Black Cabinet advised Roosevelt on civil rights policy. He was the first president to actually listen to advice from African Americans regarding issues of race and race relations.
All right. So the important thing about having a group like this at this time is that people of color were able to start voting in larger portions. So it's important to really take this group of people's opinions into account if the president wanted to stay in office. Of course, for more moral reasons, it's important to take all the constituents' opinions into account at any time. Look at this political cartoon. We've got FDR walking up the steps of government reorganization, Supreme Court revision, into a chair labeled dictator. The cartoon is called Step by Step. How does the artist feel about FDR? They think he's a socialist. They think he's a communist. They think he's a dictator. They think he has too much power. They want to cut him back a little bit. Some other New Deal programs include the Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, still exists today. This monitors the stock market and enforces laws regulating the sale of stocks and bonds. The SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission. It ensures individuals' bank accounts, protecting people against losses due to bank failures. Many of these programs are still in effect today. Why would the federal government assume some responsibility for the social welfare of its citizens? A lot of other leading nations were starting to do it at this time as well. And people typically will support their government more if their government will support them in turn. We also have the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB. This prevents unfair labor practices and to mediate disputes between workers and management. We also have the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, which constructed dams and power plants in the Tennessee Valley region to generate electricity as well as to prevent floods. Why would the government fund this? It would create jobs for people, and it's good to have prevent floods. Cost them less money in the long run, really. Though the New Deal provided relief, reform, and recovery for many Americans, it did not end the Great Depression. President Roosevelt faced rising pressure from Congress to scale back New Deal programs and cut back on spending by the end of the decade. World War II will eventually bring the United States and the world out of the Great Depression. Why would that be the thing to take them out? Mass production during a war, the government buying a ton of stuff from people. Those are some examples. All right, the rest of the time for today, we will do the study guide to the best of your ability. We can go over it together as well in class. I'm not going to go over it in this video due to time, but we also have an exit ticket for today. It's your opinion. Was the New Deal a fair deal for all Americans, and how did it affect different groups of people? That's your opinion question. In the second question, just make sure to talk about white people, women, and African American people specifically. Thanks.